most common Linux distributions. You can install Nessus on Linux servers running the Ubuntu, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, FreeBSD, SUSE, Fedora, Debian, Raspberry Pi, and Amazon Linux distributions. The installation process will vary slightly depending upon the specific distribution of Linux that you're using. I'm going to walk you through the process using an Ubuntu server. Here, I have a terminal open on an Ubuntu server. If I run the ls command, I see that the Nessus installation file is already here waiting for me. I've downloaded the file and copied it to the server before we got started. You actually can't download this file directly from the command line because you first have to go onto the Nessus website, provide your name and email address, and accept the license agreement. So if you haven't already done that, you should stop the video and obtain a copy of the installer before you continue. Once you're ready to install Nessus, go ahead and run the package installation command for your Linux distribution. On Ubuntu, I'll use the dpackage command to do that. I need to begin with the sudo command to run this as root, and then I type dpackage to run the package manager, -i to indicate that I want to install a package, and then I provide the name of the package. The package name that you use might vary if you have a newer version of Nessus or are using a different Linux distribution or architecture. Notice that after the installation completes, Nessus helpfully provides me with the next steps. I need to start the Nessus server, and then I'll be able to access the console. I'm going to type sudo, and then the command that it lists here, systemctl, start nessusd.service. Now that Nessus is up and running, we're ready to begin configuration on the web console. That's the same process for both Linux and Windows systems, so we'll come back to it after we walk through the Windows installation process. You can also install Nessus on a Windows server. Remember, Nessus uses a web-based client. That means that regardless of the operating system you install Nessus on, you'll still be able to access it from any client operating system through your web browser. Here we are at the desktop of a Windows server. We're visiting the Tenable download page where I can select the Windows Server version of Nessus. Let's go ahead and download that and accept the license agreement. And once this downloads, I'll be able to launch the installer file and I'll be brought to a standard software installation wizard. I'm going to go ahead and click Next to move past the welcome screen, accept the terms of the license agreement, and the default installation location. Then I'm going to go ahead and begin the installation process, which might take a few minutes to complete. Finally, the Nessus installer is finished with its work and Nessus is installed on my Windows server. Let's go ahead and hit Finish, and Nessus opens up the web console to show me that it's working. I want to be able to access this server from a remote location, so there's one more step that I need to complete before accessing Nessus. I need to open a rule on the Windows firewall for the Nessus web interface, which uses TCP port 8834. So, under Windows Administrative Tools, I'm going to choose the Windows Defender Firewall, and then let's click on Inbound Rules and the New Rule link. I know the port being used here, so I'm going to create a port-specific rule. That rule is for TCP port 8834, which is the Nessus port. And I want to allow all inbound connections on this port. And for the purposes of this demonstration, I'll accept connections from anywhere. When you run a Nessus server in production, you'll probably want to limit this rule to allow connections only from authorized systems, but I'm not going to worry about that for now. Finally, I'll name this rule Nessus, and then create it. Now I'm ready to access the Nessus console. We'll get to that in the next video. Once you have Nessus installed on your server, you can access it from a web browser on any system. I'm back here on my laptop, and I'm going to access the Nessus server by typing in https:// followed by the IP address of my server, a colon, and the port number for Nessus, 8834. When I first try to access the server, I get an error because the TLS certificate used on the server was not issued by a trusted certificate authority. In a production deployment of Nessus, you'd want to obtain a certificate by either purchasing it from a public certificate authority or creating one on your own internal certificate authority. For our purposes, this isn't important, so I'm going to go ahead and accept the error. Next, Nessus walks me through a few final steps in the installation process. I'm going to go ahead and hit Continue, and then I have to choose what type of installation I'd like to perform. I'm using the free Nessus Essentials Edition, so I'm going to choose that option. and press Continue. The next page asks me to enter my name and email address, or if I already have an activation code, which I do, I can skip this step to enter the activation code. After you filled out the form on the Nessus homepage, you should also have received an activation code by email. I'm going to press Skip, and then I can paste in my activation code and hit Continue. Nessus confirms my license information, and then I'm prompted to create a user account. I can select a username and a password that I'd like to use to protect access to my Nessus server. Nessus then completes the setup process and begins to download plugins. Now this might take 10 or 20 minutes while Nessus configures itself for your first use. Once it finishes, you'll be brought to the Nessus login screen where you can use your newly created username and password. Modern computing systems and applications are extremely complicated. It might not surprise you to learn that there are millions and millions of lines of code contained in every major piece of software that you run. For example, the Linux kernel is the core part of the operating system that handles input, output, memory management, CPU management, and other core tasks. This central piece of the operating system contains over 24 million lines of code, and it changes at an astonishing rate. Thousands of lines of code are added, removed, and changed every day as the kernel evolves. Given the complexity of modern software, it's inevitable that developers will make mistakes, and some of those mistakes will lead to security vulnerabilities. In the security community, we have a well-understood process for managing vulnerabilities. When a company learns of a vulnerability in their software, they analyze the issue and develop a fix for the problem known as a patch. They then release this patch through their update mechanism, and administrators around the world apply the patch to correct the security vulnerability. From an administrator's perspective, there's a lot of work to do. Modern enterprises may run several different operating systems and hundreds of applications. They also have routers, switches, Internet of Things devices, software libraries, and many other components that are being patched on a regular basis. Vulnerability management processes help administrators get a handle on this complexity. A mature vulnerability management process includes scanning systems for vulnerabilities, the application of patches, tracking of remediation, and reporting of results. In this course, we'll explore all of these topics in detail. Before you can develop a vulnerability management program, however, you need to have a firm understanding of your requirements. Why are you developing the program in the first place? Your first answer is probably that you're developing a vulnerability management program because you want your systems to be secure. That's a great answer, and it should be the core purpose of the program. You may also be developing the program because your company policy requires you to do so. You might work in a department or operating unit and be following a corporate mandate to manage vulnerabilities in your systems. If that's the case, your vulnerability management program probably needs to fit within the parameters of a higher level corporate program. You might need to use specific tools, meet corporate deadlines, and submit reports to a central office. And in many cases, companies develop vulnerability management programs because someone requires them to do so. There are a variety of regulations that apply to cybersecurity, and 2 of them have specific requirements for vulnerability scanning. The Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS, applies to anyone who handles credit card information. It has detailed requirements for vulnerability scanning, which include requiring quarterly vulnerability scans of systems and networks from both internal and external perspectives, requiring new scans whenever you make significant changes to your environment, mandating the use of an approved scanning vendor for your external scans, and remediating vulnerabilities and rescanning your systems and networks until the scan produces a clean bill of health with no significant vulnerabilities. If you work for an agency of the U.S. government, you're subject to the Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA. FISMA requires that you follow the security controls found in NIST Special Publication 800-53. This set of requirements includes a section on vulnerability management that requires that you regularly scan systems and applications for vulnerabilities, analyze the results of those scans, remediate vulnerabilities deemed legitimate, and share information about vulnerabilities with other government agencies. As you build out vulnerability scanning in your organization, you should combine three different types of vulnerability tests. Network vulnerability scans probe any devices attached to your network for security issues, while application scans test the code running on those devices for potential flaws. Web applications require specialized testing that probes for common web application security issues such as SQL injection and cross site scripting. You should also remember that vulnerability scanning doesn't happen in a vacuum. As you interpret the results of vulnerability scans, supplement those scans with reviews of system and application configurations and logs to vet the results for false positives and other errors. No matter why you're building a vulnerability management program, the basic tools and processes are the same. But before you start, it's important that you know what rules apply to you and your organization so that you can be sure to design your program to satisfy those requirements. As you get your vulnerability management program underway, your first step was to develop requirements for that program. You thought through whether the program was based upon a general desire to improve security, a response to regulatory requirements, or a reaction to corporate policy. Your next step is to turn those general requirements into a list of the specific systems and networks that you want to scan. In order to create this list, you need to have an asset inventory that you can trust. If your organization practices good asset management already, you may find that you already have this inventory ready to draw into your vulnerability management program. You might find that your organization's configuration management tools already have a complete inventory of systems and devices on your network, and in the best case, that the inventory is kept up to date with information from regular network scans. However, if you don't have this capability, you can instead turn to a scan run by your vulnerability management solution. Rather than running a full vulnerability scan, which can be very time-consuming, your system probably allows you to run a lightweight scan that just searches for systems on the network. Once the Nessus configuration completes, we can go ahead and kick off a scan. I'm going to go ahead and click New Scan. I'm going to start with a host discovery scan, where I can enter the targets that I'd like to scan. Let's give our scan a name. We'll just call it Host Discovery. And then we can enter the targets as either host names, IP addresses, or network ranges. I'm going to go ahead and enter a few host names here of systems that I control and would like to scan. Remember, you only want to scan systems that you have permission to scan and that are under your control. And then I'm going to hit Save and go ahead and launch my scan. Once that scan completes, we'll come back and take a look at the results. And now that my host discovery scan is finished, I can go ahead and click on it to view the results. And I can see the ports that were detected and the systems that were scanned. I can then use this information to kick off a more detailed vulnerability scan. Other scanners may also provide you with a graphic view of network discovery results. For example, here's an asset map created with the Qualys vulnerability scanner. Once you have a solid asset inventory, you'll need to begin prioritizing those assets. This is normally done by answering questions in three key areas about each asset. You'll want to know about the importance of the system in the scheme of things, summed up as the impact if a breach were to occur. To get at this, you'll want to be able to identify the highest data classification stored, processed, or transmitted by the system, device, or application. Clearly, you would want to assign a higher priority to systems that handle more sensitive information. Second, you'll want to know about the level of risk posed to the system based upon how exposed it is to an attacker. This is summed up as the likelihood of a successful attack. This requires first identifying the network exposure. Is the system addressable on the public internet? If it's behind a firewall, what rules exist to allow external access? You'll also want to know what services the system exposes to the outside world. Is it a web server, DNS server, database server? How likely is it that an attacker will discover vulnerabilities in the services offered by the system? Finally, you'll want to know how critical the system is to your operations. Even if the system doesn't contain sensitive information, a critical system might be very important in your vulnerability management program because business operations would be dramatically impacted if the system were not available. You'll certainly want to prioritize critical systems over their non-critical counterparts. Many organizations take the approach of scanning all of the systems, devices, and applications in their environment on a regular basis. That's absolutely fine, but it doesn't eliminate the need to perform an asset inventory and identify the criticality of different resources. Even if you're scanning everything, you're going to need a way to prioritize your remediation efforts, and the same criteria that you use to identify scanning targets are also quite helpful when you're planning remediation. Once you've used your asset inventory to develop a list of systems that you'd like to scan, you next need to figure out how often you'd like to scan those systems. Now, this might sound like a simple question. After all, why wouldn't you just want to scan all of your systems all of the time? But there are some constraints that require you to think carefully about your scanning schedule. First, you may have specific requirements imposed on you that dictate how often you conduct scans. These may come from external sources such as laws and regulations. For example, if you're subject to PCI DSS, you'll need to run scans at least quarterly. Or you may have corporate policy requirements that dictate the frequency of scanning systems. Once you've cleared those requirements, you'll also need to consider your organization's risk appetite. How long are you willing to go without detecting a new vulnerability? Does that risk appetite vary for systems that have higher criticality, likelihood, and impact ratings in your asset inventory? On the surface, this may seem like an easy question to answer, but you'll probably need to make some difficult trade-off decisions when determining your risk appetite because of other factors that limit your ability to run scans very frequently. One of these other factors is that you probably have technical constraints on your scanning. For example, if you have only one scanner, it can only perform so many scans per day. It's not uncommon for an organization to have a network large enough that it's simply not possible to scan the entire network every day because the scans would never finish. It's kind of like mowing the lawn on a large college campus. Your job is never done. Technical constraints may also include limits on network bandwidth or other parameters. Constraints may also come from the business. For example, the impact of scans may slow down other systems on the network, and the business may decide that scans should not take place during critical operational periods. Finally, you may have licensing constraints that restrict your ability to use your vulnerability scanner based upon the number of scans running simultaneously, the number of IP addresses scanned, or the amount of bandwidth used. You'll need to balance all of these requirements to develop a scanning schedule for your organization that meets regulatory requirements and satisfies your risk appetite while not running afoul of business, technical, or licensing constraints. Let's take a look at how we can set up a scanning schedule in Nessus. I'm looking at the host discovery scan that I set up earlier. I can see that the schedule is currently set to on demand, meaning this scan will run when I ask it to run. Let's say that I want to run this scan every Tuesday to check for new systems on the network. I can do that by configuring a schedule for the scan. I go ahead and select the scan, and then hit the configure option, and then under schedule, I can enable the schedule, say that I'd like to run this scan automatically on a weekly basis, and then pick the day or days that I would like that scan to run. I can look down on the summary here and say this scan is now scheduled to run every week on Tuesday at 11:30 a.m. I'll go ahead and save this, and then when I go back and look at my scans, I can see the schedule is set up to run weekly on Tuesday at 11:30. When you set up scanning schedules, you should think through how they will impact your remediation workflow as well. You want to ensure that cybersecurity analysts in your organization have access to the most current information possible. So if you can time your scans to complete just before analysts are going to review them, you'll provide those analysts with the most current possible information. Many organizations are moving away from a scheduled scan approach and adopting a continuous monitoring philosophy that performs ongoing scanning without stopping. The scanner works on a rotating basis, checking systems for vulnerabilities as often as resources permit. This can consume quite a bit of network bandwidth and processor time, but it does allow for the early detection of vulnerabilities. Now, we've already run a couple of simple vulnerability scans in this course, but now let's explore the process of setting up a vulnerability scan in more detail. I'm back in Nessus, and I'm going to set up a new scan from scratch. When I go ahead and click the New Scan button, I'm presented with a series of templates to choose from. These are pre-configured scan settings that I can choose if I don't want to set everything myself. I'd like to look at all of the options, so I'm going to go ahead and click Advanced Scan, which allows me to choose my own settings. The initial screen that I see lets me enter some basic information about the scan. I can give it a name. I'm going to go ahead and call this Mike's Scan. I could fill in a description if I want to, but I'm going to leave that blank for now. The most important part of this page of settings is the Targets box. That's where I configure the scope of the scan. In this box, I can enter system names, IP addresses, or network ranges that contain the systems that I'd like to scan. I'm going to set my scan to run on a local network here. I'd like to scan all of the systems in the 172.30/24 network. So let me go ahead and enter that address range. And now that's 255 IP addresses represented by this range. Nessus is going to scan all of those to see if systems are active, and then perform vulnerability scans on those systems that respond. Now notice down here that there's a link to upload a target file. This is useful if your organization has a separate asset management tool. You can export a list of systems from that tool and import it here so that you don't have to retype or cut and paste everything. When I'm creating a scan program, I generally want to organize it into a series of scans that each include systems that will be scanned at the same time. For example, if I decided that I want to set the scanning frequency based upon the types of data that a system processes, I might create different scans for systems that process confidential, sensitive, and highly sensitive information. This allows me to set different schedules for each of these system groups. We've already looked at the Schedule tab. I'm going to enable this scan to run on a schedule, and I'm going to ask that it run every day. I'm going to go to the Notification tab and say that I would like the scanner to send me a report by email every time the scan finishes. Let's go ahead and save this. Now let's take a look at the discovery options. This is where I can provide Nessus with instructions about how to decide if a system is alive on the network. I can configure the types of network pings and how Nessus should handle devices like printers and netware systems that might react negatively to a scan. On the Port Scanning tab, I can set the specific ports that I'd like Nessus to scan, and also tell it which protocols to use when scanning for open ports. The default settings for Nessus include all commonly used ports, so I'm going to leave that setting alone, but if your network uses custom ports, you can configure those here. In the assessment section of the scan configuration, I can set the scan sensitivity level. This is an important setting. When you're performing any type of scan, you run the risk of false alarms. These can waste the time of cybersecurity analysts. By default, Nessus uses what it calls normal accuracy. Think of this as a medium setting that seeks to balance the risk of a false alarm with the risk of missing a real vulnerability. If you'd like, you can change this setting to err on the side of reporting a vulnerability, which will give you more false alarms, by checking the Override Normal Accuracy box and then choosing Show Potential False Alarms. Or you can make Nessus try to avoid false alarms more than the default by choosing Avoid Potential False Alarms. The last setting page we'll look at is the Advanced page. This has a few important settings. First, notice the first box that's checked here. Enable Safe Checks. This setting tells Nessus to avoid performing scans that might disrupt a system. It's probably best to leave this box checked when you're working in a production environment. You may wish to uncheck it if you're scanning systems prior to their deployment in production to get the most thorough scan results possible. There are also some settings on this page that allow you to alter the performance of the scan. You can choose to stop scanning hosts that become unresponsive during the scan IP addresses in a random order, automatically accept detected SSH disclaimer prompts, scan targets with multiple domain names in parallel, and create a unique identifier on hosts scanned using credentials. There are lots of other options here as well that you can go through and configure as appropriate for your environment. Nessus uses plugins to perform vulnerability checks. Each plugin is designed to check for one specific vulnerability, and plugins are organized by the types of systems that they affect. You'll see the settings for plugins in the Plugins tab here. If I'd like, I could go through and configure these settings to only include the plugins for applications and services that I know exist in my environment. This will make scans complete faster. Vulnerability scanners offer a wide variety of configuration options that allow you to customize the scanner's performance. If you find yourself tweaking these settings, be sure to create your own custom templates so that you can easily reuse your settings across many scans. All vulnerability scans are not alike. While you may set scans to test the same systems using the same tool on the same ports and services, there are still other factors that may affect what you see in your scan results. Let's talk about scan perspective. The most important component of scan perspective is the scanner's location on the network relative to the systems being scanned. For example, consider this typical network diagram showing a firewall that connects an organization to the internet and also segments a screened subnet that contains a web server accessible to the outside world. If, as in this diagram, the vulnerability scanner is also in the screened subnet, it has unrestricted access to the web server because it doesn't need to pass through the firewall to get there. However, if the vulnerability scanner is instead located on the internal network, we have a totally different picture. Now, the vulnerability scanner's traffic must pass through the firewall on the way to the web server. The firewall will drop any connection attempts that don't match firewall rules, and it may also perform filtering that drops traffic suspected to be malicious. That may prevent the scanner from detecting some vulnerabilities that it would have seen if it were positioned on the screen subnet. Finally, if we move the scanner out to the internet, we get a totally different perspective. The traffic from the scanner still needs to pass through the firewall, but now it's subject to the firewall rules that regulate inbound traffic from the internet. Presumably, those are far more strict than the rules for the internal network. So in this configuration, the scanner will likely see the fewest possible vulnerabilities. So which of these perspectives is correct? Well, they all are. They offer different perspectives that each may be valuable to a cybersecurity analyst. For example, placing the scanner on the screen subnet provides the clearest possible picture of vulnerabilities on the target system. If I want to know all of the problems that I might have, this is the way to get them because the scanner has the greatest permissions to access the target system. However, placing the scanner on the internet gives me the attacker's view into my network. I can see the same vulnerabilities that an attacker might see if running a scan from the outside. This is very valuable to me because it helps me prioritize my remediation efforts. If an attacker can see an exploitable vulnerability, I'd better fix it quickly. All of the scans that we've talked about so far are server-based scans, where the vulnerability scanner reaches out over the network to connect to a system and probe it for vulnerabilities. There's another technique you can use to get a different scan perspective. Agent-based scans install a security agent on each server that can probe deeply into the server's configuration and check for vulnerabilities. These agents then report any weaknesses they discover back to the central vulnerability management system. This provides great insight, but some organizations choose not to use agent-based scanning because they don't want to install software on all of their servers, increasing the complexity of their environment. An alternative to agent-based scanning is credentialed scanning. In this approach, you provide the scanner with credentials that it can use to log into the remote system and pull configuration information. Let's take a look at how we can configure credential-based scanning in Nessus. In the settings for a scan, I can choose the Credentials tab, and then I'm given different options. If I'm accessing a Linux system, I can go ahead and provide SSH credentials used to access that system. If I'm accessing a Windows system, I can go ahead and provide the username, password, and Active Directory domain that should be used to connect to the system. Perspective is an important consideration when you're designing a vulnerability scanning program. It's good practice to mix several different perspectives in your scanning to get the most comprehensive picture possible of your network. As with any technology device, vulnerability scanners require maintenance. Most of this maintenance comes in the form of making sure that you apply updates to the scanner on a regular basis. These come in two forms. First, the scanner itself requires engine updates. These are updates to the scanning software and may fix bugs or add new features to the scanner. Scanning engine updates are relatively infrequent. They come as often as you'd expect to update any other piece of software that you run. Second, you need to update your scanner's vulnerability feed. These are the plugins that tell the scanner what vulnerabilities to check on scanned systems and how to check them. You should update your plugins very frequently so that you don't miss the ability to scan for newly discovered vulnerabilities. Let's take a look at how we can configure updates in Nessus. It's actually pretty easy to configure automatic updates just like you would for your operating system. Go ahead and click the Settings tab, and then under Software Update, you can choose whether you want to update all components, only update plugins, or disable automatic updates. The default settings that we're going to keep are to update all plugins on a daily basis. Another important scanner maintenance task is managing user permissions on the scanner. If your scanner is licensed for multiple users, you'll need to configure their accounts and set their permissions. You might restrict users to performing certain activities, such as providing some users with read-only access and preventing them from performing their own scans. You also might limit the networks and systems that different users can view. You'll need to figure out the specific permissions and access settings that work best in your environment. Vulnerability scans are only useful if you communicate the results to people who have the ability to resolve the vulnerabilities that scans detect. That's where reporting comes into play. The most important thing you should consider when planning vulnerability scan communication is your target audience. It's likely that you'll want to share the results with several different groups of people. For example, the cybersecurity team is probably interested in the nitty-gritty of scan results. They want details about the systems affected, the specific vulnerabilities uncovered, and remediation steps. Management, on the other hand, is probably less interested in technical detail and more interested in tracking the highest risk vulnerabilities and monitoring trends over time. They'll want to be able to answer questions like, have we addressed our most serious issues? And how long is it taking us, on average, to resolve the most important vulnerabilities? System and network engineers will also be very interested in scan results because they bear responsibility for maintaining the security of the devices that were scanned. They're the people in the best position to remediate vulnerabilities, and they'll want information tailored to that purpose. Engineers will generally have a specific scope of interest. They only really care about the devices they manage, and they'll want specific details on how to fix the issues raised in the report. Application developers will also be quite interested in scan results, but again with a limited scope. They'll want to know about vulnerabilities in their applications, such as SQL injection or cross-site scripting. The type of detail they want will also differ from other groups. They want to know where in the code the vulnerability resides. For example, if you have a SQL injection vulnerability, a developer is going to want to know what web application has the vulnerability and specifically which variable is at issue. Better yet, provide them with an example of a specific exploit against their code. Vulnerability scanners make reporting for all of these different audiences easy by providing reporting templates that cater to different groups. Let's take a look at an example. I'm going to go ahead and look at a scan that I ran. And here, in addition to reviewing the results interactively, I can go ahead and create a report. I'm then given a list of report templates that I can use. Let's say I want to look at a complete list of vulnerabilities by host, and I'd like it in HTML format so I can go ahead and view it in the web browser. I just click Generate Report, and then Nessus downloads an HTML file to my system that I can then share with others. This report first shows information at a high level, telling me how many vulnerabilities of each severity are on each system, and then I can drill into the specific results for remediation purposes. I can also click on any of these plugins to get very detailed information about the vulnerability at hand. You'll also need to decide how to distribute vulnerability scan reports. You may choose to grant individuals direct access to the scanner so that they can go in and read reports directly and customize them to their personal preferences. Or you can set up report distribution that pushes reports into users' inboxes. When you do this, you can choose either automated or manual distribution. Reports might arrive automatically after each scan, once a week, or only on request. You'll want to tailor your reporting to the needs and desires of your audience. So you just ran your first scan, and now you're staring at a report that lists dozens of vulnerabilities across your systems. This can be a very overwhelming sight for the new cybersecurity analyst. How am I possibly going to fix all of these things? Well, let me share with you one important piece of insight. You're not going to fix all of these things. There isn't enough time in the day to track down every possible vulnerability in your organization, and frankly, many of them aren't worth the effort. Let's talk about how we go about prioritizing vulnerability remediation. There are 5 major factors that we should take into account when we're developing our remediation priority list. First, how critical is the system that contains the vulnerability? Is this a crucial web server that runs the core of our business? Or is it a test server that serves a small group of developers who use it infrequently? The more crucial a system, the more important it is to resolve the vulnerability so that we can avoid availability issues. Second, how sensitive is the information stored, processed, and transmitted by the system? If the system contains highly sensitive information, such as credit card numbers or social security numbers, we clearly need to prioritize it for remediation because there's a clear confidentiality risk. If an attacker gets a hold of our customer credit card numbers, that would clearly have a tremendous impact on our business. The next factor we should consider is the severity of the vulnerability. How serious is the issue? If an attacker exploited this vulnerability, would they be able to gain full control of the system and the data it processes? That would be very serious. Or would they simply be able to gain a listing of users on the system? That's probably less severe. Vulnerability scanners help us identify the severity of a vulnerability by assigning each one vulnerability ratings. You can see here in this Nessus report that we have 5 different severity ratings. They begin with informational vulnerabilities, which are simply facts that the scanner detected and normally don't require action. Then they increase in severity through the levels of low, medium, high, and critical severity. Those vulnerabilities assigned critical severity are the ones that are extremely dangerous. They typically allow an attacker to take complete control of an affected device and should be resolved as soon as possible. We also need to take the difficulty of remediation into account. Some vulnerabilities arise because of deep architectural issues and require costly and time-consuming redesigns to fix. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't fix them, but all other things equal, if there are other vulnerabilities of equal severity that are easier to fix, we would probably tackle those first. Finally, we must consider the exposure of the vulnerability. Where would an attacker need to be to exploit this vulnerability? Is the system exposed to the internet? If so, can an attacker remotely exploit the vulnerability without having an account on the system? That's pretty severe. On the other hand, we'd probably be less concerned about a vulnerability that requires local user access on a system located on an isolated VLAN. It would just be harder for an attacker to get their hands on that system. Vulnerability prioritization is an inexact science. Yes, we should have a standard approach and best practices within our organization for prioritizing remediation, but cybersecurity analysts also need to apply judgment and common sense to follow a strategy that makes sense for their organization. There's another challenge you face when you're dealing with the overwhelming aftermath of a vulnerability scan. Many people may need to be involved in the remediation of these issues. We might need cybersecurity analysts to validate the results, system engineers to apply operating system patches, network engineers to adjust firewall rules, developers to modify applications, and a vulnerability specialist to run a new scan to verify that everything's worked properly. There are a lot of tasks to be done by a lot of people, and it would be very easy for us to lose track of some of them. Vulnerability remediation workflows help us tackle these issues in an organized way. We can define the steps that we'll follow each time we encounter a new vulnerability that requires remediation. For example, here's a common process. First, we run a scan that detects a new vulnerability in the environment. Let's say we detect a missing patch on a file server. Next, we assign that vulnerability to a cybersecurity analyst for further review. The analyst might first validate that the vulnerability really exists and that we're not dealing with a false positive. Next, the analyst should prioritize the vulnerability based on the criteria that we discussed earlier. We then move to the remediation phase where technical staff correct the vulnerability. In the case of our missing patch, we'd likely need a system engineer to apply the patch in production. That should follow the organization's normal change control process, including sandboxing and testing as appropriate. Once the engineer is confident that they've resolved the vulnerability, we move into the remediation validation phase, and control normally moves back to a cybersecurity analyst. The analyst runs a new vulnerability scan and confirms that the issue no longer appears. If the scan still reports the vulnerability, more investigation takes place, but otherwise we can close out the issue and move on to the next thing. Some vulnerability scanners do have built-in workflow tools, but it's often a better practice to work with the incident management tool used by the IT organization instead. Most enterprise IT groups have a ticketing system that they use for issue resolution, and all of the technical staff are already comfortable with that system. Rather than making them learn something new and have another place to check, the most successful vulnerability remediation programs integrate their workflow with the existing incident management capabilities of the organization. The more you can automate your workflow, the better. For example, if you do choose to integrate vulnerability remediation with your IT ticketing system, you might be able to automate that integration so that the vulnerability scanner automatically opens tickets when new vulnerabilities arise. If you want to get fancier, you can even incorporate your vulnerability prioritization criteria into that decision, only creating tickets for vulnerabilities that exceed predefined thresholds. If you're able to tie the vulnerability to a specific host, your ticketing system may be able to automatically assign the ticket to the relevant engineer or team for resolution. Another great automation time saver is to allow the scanner to perform remediation validation automatically. Once an engineer remediates a vulnerability, the scanner might kick off an automatic rescan, and then, if the vulnerability is resolved, the scanner can automatically close the ticket without requiring the intervention of a cybersecurity analyst. Workflows are crucial to managing the large number of vulnerabilities detected during most scans. They also provide a rigorous process for resolving and tracking vulnerabilities and provide opportunities for automating much of the routine work of vulnerability management. As you work your way through the vulnerability remediation workflow, you're going to encounter barriers to remediation. You'll come across people who, for a variety of reasons, think that addressing the vulnerability is not in the organization's best interests. Let's talk about some of the people you might encounter during your remediation efforts and discuss ways that you can address the issues that they raise in a way that covers their objections but still resolves the vulnerability. Meet Grumpy Gus. Gus is a system engineer who has quite a cranky attitude. So much so that no one on the security team really wants to talk to Gus because they know that he'll argue with everything they say. But Gus is also highly skilled. He's a very knowledgeable engineer, and his primary concern is keeping his systems up and running. When you bring a vulnerability to Gus, he might grumble that the vulnerability isn't real and that applying the suggested fix would cause technical issues and degrade functionality for his users. Gus might also mention that the vulnerability is in a legacy system, making it difficult to fix, or a proprietary system that is so obscure that nobody would detect the vulnerability. One of the best ways to handle Gus is with the facts. Demonstrate to him that the vulnerability is indeed real by showing him test results. If you were able to detect the problem using off-the-shelf tools, so could an attacker. Offer to help Gus set up a test environment where he can try the patch out and make sure that it doesn't affect functionality before rolling it out into production. Gus might not take you up on the offer because he might prefer to do the work himself, but you're likely to get much further with him if you acknowledge the difficulty of his job and recognize that testing is a crucial step in the remediation process. Now meet Bureaucratic Bob. Bob is an IT manager who is extremely concerned with process and organizational governance. When you present him with an urgent vulnerability that requires immediate remediation, Bob might throw process obstacles in the way. Instead of having his team jump on the fix immediately, he asks whether you've gone through the change control process and have a series of approvals for the remediation. The best way to handle Bob is with prior planning. Change management is important, and Bob's not wrong to say that changes should go through appropriate governance processes. However, those processes should have an accelerated path for urgent issues. For example, you might have an emergency change process that requires only a single management approval and allows the application of fixes without full documentation as long as you circle back after you're done and dot the I's and cross the T's. If you can point to this emergency process, you'll put Bureaucratic Bob's objections to bed. Next, meet Functional Fran. Fran is the manager of a non-technical department that depends upon the systems that you need to remediate. She's not sure what you're talking about when it comes to vulnerabilities, but she knows that you can't take the system down for patching because it would cause an unacceptable business process interruption. You can make Fran happy by first acknowledging that the business is indeed the reason that you're all here and that you share her concerns. Explain that if left uncorrected, the vulnerability could cause a serious and prolonged disruption to the business and that a little preventive maintenance will go a long way. Work with Fran to schedule the remediation for the time that's most acceptable to her and her customers. Maybe you can apply a patch in the middle of the night when nobody's using the system. Make sure Fran understands that you'll go out of your way to help her team, but that correcting the vulnerability is in everyone's interest. Finally, meet Selling Sally. Sally is a customer account manager, and she's the one responsible to your customers for providing service. When things go wrong, Sally's also on the front lines handling customer complaints. When you approach her about a remediation related outage, she might show you the memorandum of understanding or service level agreements that you have with customers guaranteeing uptime and notice of outages. You can handle Sally using some of the same techniques that you used for Fran and Bob. First, make sure that Sally understands that fixing the vulnerability will actually reduce the likelihood of customer impact. But, as with Bob's concerns, you'll have a much easier time with Sally if you work with her in advance to ensure that you have processes in place to address vulnerabilities. Those MOUs and SLAs should include provisions for regular and emergency maintenance that allow you to keep the system in tip-top shape without running afoul of customer commitments. There are a lot of needs to manage when you're remediating vulnerabilities. Remember, this isn't all technical work, and keeping stakeholder needs front of mind can make things much easier. You've probably already figured out that there's a ton of jargon in the world of vulnerability management, and it can be a little bit confusing. We might use the terms web application vulnerability, SQL injection issue, and input validation flaw, all to refer to the same thing. We also might talk about a vulnerability as being severe, critical, or urgent. There's a lot of ambiguity in our language, and that ambiguity is not only confusing for all of us, it can also prevent us from automating vulnerability activities. It's as if our systems don't speak the same language. That's where the Security Content Automation Protocol, SCAP, comes into play. SCAP is an effort led by the National Institute of Standards and Technology to create a consistent language and format for discussing security issues. Systems that adhere to SCAP standards are able to share information in a way that describes environments, vulnerabilities, and remediation steps using consistent language. SCAP has several components. Let me give you a quick run through them at a high level, and then we're going to dig into one in more detail. The one we'll explore in the most depth is the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS. CVSS is widely used throughout the security community because it provides a consistent way to evaluate the severity of security vulnerabilities. CVSS scores are found in most vulnerability scanning products and are seen on scan reports. I'll talk more about CVSS in a minute. Common Configuration Enumeration, CCE, is another SCAP component. It gives us a consistent language to use when sharing system configurations. Common Platform Enumeration, CPE, does the same thing for product names and versions, providing a standardized language. Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, CVE, gives us a language for describing vulnerabilities. The Extensible Configuration Checklist Description Format, XCCDF, provides a language for creating and sharing checklists and the results of processing checklists. And finally, the Open Vulnerability Assessment Language, OVAL, gives us a way to describe testing procedures in a programmatic fashion. Let's dig into the Common Vulnerability Scoring System because you'll see that used on scan reports. CVSS assigns a score to each vulnerability on a 10-point scale. We can figure out a base CVSS score by evaluating a set of different metrics and then combining the results. The first metric is the attack vector metric. This describes the type of access that an attacker must have to exploit a vulnerability. The value for this metric can be physical, meaning that the attacker must be able to physically touch or manipulate the target system; local, meaning that the attacker must have physical or logical access to the system's console; or it can be adjacent network, meaning that the attacker must have access to the system's local network; or it can be network, meaning that the vulnerability is remotely exploitable. The next metric is the attack complexity metric. This measures how difficult it is to exploit a vulnerability, whether the attacker must evade built-in security controls. We assign this metric a value of high if the vulnerability requires this type of evasive activity, or low if it does not. The next metric is the attack requirements metric. This describes the conditions necessary on the vulnerable system to conduct the attack. This metric is set to present if there must be specific conditions in place on the target system for the attack to succeed, or none if the attack will likely succeed against any vulnerable system that an attacker can reach. We next look at what user-level access the attacker must have to exploit the vulnerability using the privileges required metric. We assign this a value of high if the attack requires that the attacker first obtain administrative privileges, low if the attack requires the use of a basic user account, or none if an attacker can exploit the vulnerability without any prior access to the system. Then we assess the level of victim user involvement needed with the user interaction metric. This metric is set to active if the attacker must somehow get an authorized user to take very specific, conscious action to make the attack work. Passive if the user has to perform some action that will likely seem innocuous to them, or none if the attacker can carry out the attack on their own without any involvement from a user. Those 5 metrics, attack vector, attack complexity, attack requirements, privileges required, and user interaction, combine to describe the exploitability of a vulnerability. In addition to exploitability, we must also consider the impact, and that's where the next metrics come into play. We look at the impact using the 3 elements of the CIA triad, beginning with confidentiality. We assign a confidentiality rating of none if there is no confidentiality impact, low if the attacker would have access to some but not all information, and high if all information on the system would be compromised. We then move on to integrity, and again assign a rating of none if there is no integrity impact, partial if the attacker could modify some information, and complete if the attacker could modify all information at will. And finally, we look at availability, assigning a rating of none if there is no availability impact, partial if there would be some degradation of performance, and complete if the attacker could shut down the system. These 3 metrics, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, combine to describe the impact of a vulnerability. Together, the exploitability and impact metrics combine to create a CVSS base score. We'll discuss that more in the next video. Once we've assigned ratings to the individual CVSS metrics, we can combine those ratings to determine the base CVSS score. Let's walk through an example. Here's the CVSS vector for a vulnerability where Nessus detected support for the outdated SSL protocol. Now, it looks like just a string of characters, but we now have the information that we need to make sense of it. First, we see here that the string was created using CVSS version 4, so we know what tools to use to interpret it. AV:(n) means that the attack vector is network. An attacker can exploit this vulnerability remotely over the network. AC:(L) means that the attack complexity is low. It would be easy to exploit this vulnerability. AT:(n) means that the attack requirements are none. There are no special conditions necessary to exploit this vulnerability. PRN means that there are no special privileges required to execute the vulnerability. The attacker does not need an existing user or administrator account. UIN means that no user interaction is required. The attacker can carry out this vulnerability on their own. From there, we move on to the impact ratings, where we see that there is a high risk of confidentiality loss. That makes sense because this vulnerability might result in the ability of an attacker to eavesdrop on sensitive communications. Now, notice here that there are actually 2 confidentiality scores. VC is the confidentiality score for the vulnerable system, the one affected directly by the vulnerability. SC is the confidentiality score for subsequent systems, those that might be secondary targets of the vulnerability. We see that there is no integrity risk from this vulnerability, and there is also no availability risk. So how do we combine these ratings into a single base score? You could try to do it by hand, but fortunately there's a calculator that does the work for us. This calculator allows us to plug in the values for individual metrics. Let's go ahead and do that. First, we're going to go ahead and keep the default setting of attack vector network. The attack complexity for this attack is low. The attack requirements are none. Privileges required are none. And user interaction is none. We then move on to the vulnerable system impact metrics. For confidentiality, we had that as high. Integrity and availability are both none. Then for the subsequent system, we set the confidentiality metric to high and leave the default settings of none for integrity and availability. And the result that we get, 9.2, is the same overall CVSS score that Nessus reported for this vulnerability. You can interpret CVSS scores using a standard scale provided by NIST. Vulnerabilities with a score of 0 receive a severity of none, while those with a score less than 4 are considered low severity. Those between 4 and 6.9 are medium, severities of at least 7 but less than 9 are high, and those scoring between 9 and 10 are critical. As a cybersecurity analyst, you'll likely spend a good amount of your time analyzing reports from vulnerability scans. One of your primary responsibilities will be sorting through the results of these scans and presenting information from them to a variety of audiences. You'll need to provide engineers, developers, and administrators with the technical detail they need to correct issues. You'll also need to explain trends and high-level risk ratings to business leaders, and you'll need to present security management with a picture of how well the organization is doing at managing risk. As you interpret the results of any scan report, you should first focus on the 5 factors that we've already discussed: the severity of the vulnerability, the criticality of the systems affected, the sensitivity of information involved, the difficulty of remediation, and the exposure of the system with the vulnerability. These 5 factors will help you triage the various vulnerabilities that you face and feed the right priorities into your vulnerability remediation workflow. Before you request remediation of a vulnerability, it's important to validate the vulnerability. This is where you go beyond the information provided by the vulnerability scanner and add some of your own security expertise to confirm that the vulnerability exists and that it was properly rated in the prioritization process. The first thing you should check during vulnerability validation is that the vulnerability actually exists as stated in the report. Vulnerability scanners do produce false positive reports for a variety of reasons. It could be that the scanner is using a signature that's not well defined, or that the scanner is not able to detect the presence of a security control that mitigates the vulnerability. In any case, you should carefully review vulnerabilities, especially those that require extensive or disruptive remediation, to verify that the problem exists. The best way to do this is to review the details on the scan report. The reports contain a section showing any input that the scanner sent to the target system and the resulting output. Reviewing this section is a great way to figure out why the scanner reported a vulnerability and whether it might be a mistake. For example, this report is showing a critical vulnerability in the version of the Apache web server running on a host on the network. Clearly, this is important to address if it's true. The CVSS score is 9.8, and there's all sorts of dire language in this report about how an attacker could exploit the system. If I scroll down and look at the output section of this report, I see that the scanner is providing me with a specific version number of Apache running on the system, as well as the version required to fix the vulnerability. To validate this report, I would want to review the alerts described in the report, understand the issue, and then log on to the system to confirm that it is running an affected version of Apache. Sometimes, false positives are easy to clear. If I see a report that a Windows server is missing a Mac OS patch, I can probably safely assume that it's a false positive report. It's still a good idea to dig in and figure out why the report is occurring, but these things happen. In other cases, the organization might have already acknowledged that a vulnerability exists on a system and implemented a compensating control or decided to accept the risk. Be sure to track these exceptions in your scanner or in a configuration management database. You don't want to report a vulnerability that everybody already knew about. It's very important to detect false positive reports and exceptions before escalating vulnerabilities for remediation, because you risk losing credibility if you become the cybersecurity analyst who cried wolf. If engineers and developers begin to doubt your thoroughness in screening vulnerability reports, they're much less likely to take your concerns seriously when you raise them in the future. There are 4 possible outcomes for any vulnerability report. If the vulnerability scanner reports a finding and the vulnerability really exists, that's a true positive report. If the vulnerability scanner reports a finding and the vulnerability does not really exist, that's a false positive report. There are also 2 outcomes that can occur if the vulnerability scanner does not report a finding. If there is no finding and there was no vulnerability, That's a true negative report. But if the vulnerability scanner misses an actual vulnerability, that's a false negative report. In addition to validating your scan results to eliminate false positive reports and remove documented exceptions, you'll also want to correlate scan reports with information available to you from other sources. The first source of information you should consult is any industry standards, best practices, or compliance obligations that are relevant to your organization. These standards may provide specific guidance on the types of vulnerabilities that require more urgent remediation. For example, PCI DSS contains some very specific guidance on vulnerability scanning. Let me give you a quote from the standard's quick reference guide. To receive a pass, external scan reports must not include any vulnerability that has been assigned a CVSS base score equal to or higher than 4.0, or any vulnerability that indicates features or configurations that are in violation of PCI DSS. That's very explicit guidance that is very helpful to an analyst in a PCI DSS computing environment. It can be summed up by this table, extracted from the PCI DSS Quick Reference Guide. The second source of information that you should correlate is the technical information that already exists within your own organization. You should look at configuration management systems, log repositories, and other data sources that might contribute information to your results. These information sources can be particularly useful in detecting and eliminating false positive reports. Finally, you should also correlate vulnerability scan information with itself. Now, that might sound strange, but what I mean is that you should watch for historical trends in your scans. The dashboard that you see here is an example of how Tenable's Security Center displays trend information in an easy-to-read format. If the same types of vulnerabilities keep arising, maybe there's an underlying issue that you should address. For example, if new web applications consistently exhibit cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, you should address that issue with developers. You can address the root cause by providing them with security training or even by creating standard input validation libraries that developers can use to armor their code against attack. It's far better to stop a vulnerability from occurring in the first place than to remediate one that already exists. Now that you have a strong understanding of vulnerability management techniques, let's dive into some of the specific vulnerabilities that you might face in your environment. We'll begin with server vulnerabilities. One of the most common issues that you'll find in a scan report is a server or device that's running out-of-date software. You might be missing a patch from your operating system, running an outdated version of an application, or running an old firmware version on a network device. It's important to keep devices patched with current updates because many of the issues that patches correct are security flaws. If you don't apply the patch, you'll be vulnerable to a security issue that the hacking community has on their radar. Here's an example of a scan report showing quite a few vulnerabilities related to missing patches. This whole first screen of updates looks incredibly overwhelming with a lot of critical and high alerts, but they all boil down to the same basic issue. This Apache web server is out of date. Running security updates on the operating system should make all of these issues disappear. A related issue occurs when you run an unsupported operating system. At some point in the life cycle of an operating system, the vendor decides that they simply won't support it any longer. Even if security issues arise, they won't create a patch. You should never run unsupported operating systems in your environment because the risk is just too high. Buffer overflow vulnerabilities occur when an operating system or application doesn't perform proper memory management. If an attacker is able to provide a program with carefully crafted input, they may be able to take control of the target system. Here's an example of a buffer overflow vulnerability in the report. The solution for this problem, as with most buffer overflow vulnerabilities, is to apply a patch. Buffer overflows, along with other vulnerabilities, can also create situations where an attacker can conduct a privilege escalation attack. This simply means that they can start with a normal user account and exploit a vulnerability to give that account administrative privileges. Systems may also be configured to support insecure protocols that exchange sensitive information in clear text format. Finally, you may encounter servers that are configured to support debugging modes and provide very detailed error messages. This is not something that an attacker can directly exploit, but it may provide an attacker with information necessary to conduct an attack. Here's an example of a server that has debugging mode enabled appearing in a vulnerability scan report. The easy fix here is to disable debugging mode on all production servers and any server with public access. There are many different vulnerabilities that might show up in a server environment. I've shown you a few, but you should get some experience reading and interpreting scan reports yourself. The critical skill that you need as a cybersecurity analyst is the ability to understand the nature of a vulnerability, assess it, and develop a remediation plan. The security issues associated with endpoint devices are quite similar to those associated with servers. In most cases, endpoints should actually be configured in a much more locked down way than a server because they don't normally accept inbound connections. You'll find that the most common issue on endpoint systems is missing security patches and outdated signature files for security tools. If a user has the opportunity to decline software updates, they'll often do that to avoid the annoyance of a reboot. If your scan reports begin showing large numbers of missing security patches, you might want to tackle the root cause by looking at your endpoint patch management strategy and seeing if there are controls that you can put in place to better patch your systems. If users are allowed to install and configure their own software on endpoint devices, that also further complicates the situation by adding complexity to your environment. More software means more security updates, and if the IT group isn't aware of the software, they can't stay on top of the updates. Remember that not all endpoints are computers. You should also be thinking about security updates and other vulnerabilities that might arise in smartphones, tablets, and whatever other devices emerge on your network. Our networks are complex and carry large quantities of sensitive information on a regular basis. There are several categories of vulnerability that might arise in our network infrastructure, network appliances, and networking protocols. Let's dive into a few examples. Some of the most common network vulnerabilities that we see come from either the failure to apply encryption to sensitive data or misconfigurations in the way that we handle encryption. Topping the list are issues associated with SSL and TLS. SSL is no longer considered a secure protocol and should never be used, but you still might find it on production systems. TLS is very widely used and provides security for many of the applications that we use every day. HTTPS relies on TLS for encrypted web traffic. VPNs use it for secure network links, and SSH, SCP, and other administrative tools rely upon TLS to provide encryption. There are three categories of SSL and TLS issues that we'll discuss. First, you might encounter outdated protocols. Even though some people still use the term SSL when they're referring to network encryption, SSL should no longer be used. It's fundamentally broken and has serious security flaws. TLS replaced SSL years ago, and even earlier versions of TLS are insecure. Make sure that you're running at least TLS 1.2 in your environment, although it's better to use the more secure TLS 1.3. Second, you might encounter the use of insecure cipher suites. TLS doesn't actually do encryption itself. It just provides the framework for encryption to take place over a network connection. You also need to select an encryption algorithm, known as a cipher suite, and you need to make sure that the encryption algorithm you choose is secure. You should configure your servers to only support connections by clients using secure cipher suites. Finally, you'll probably encounter all kinds of issues with digital certificates. Make sure that the certificates used in your environment are not expired, are signed by a reputable certificate authority, and match the names of the servers that you're running. Small errors in certificate use can cause big security issues. Here's a look at a scan report for a network system that has a bunch of SSL issues. We can see there are issues here about only using medium-strength ciphers, using self-signed certificates, expired certificates, and lots of other issues that appear within SSL and TLS. If your organization runs a virtual private network, or VPN, you should also check the encryption settings on that device for similar issues. Make sure that the VPN only supports the use of strong encryption protocols and that it and all other network appliances are regularly patched. Another common source of vulnerabilities is the domain name service, DNS. Many DNS servers need to accept queries from unknown outsiders, and this leaves them open to attack. Be sure that your DNS servers are patched with the most recent security updates to avoid them becoming the victim of a successful attack. Finally, pay careful attention to any interconnected networks that exist in your environment. If you have direct connections to partners, customers, cloud providers, or other organizations' networks, make sure that you understand the vulnerability management that takes place on their network, and also put firewalls and other protections in place to limit your exposure to vulnerable systems on those interconnected networks. SQL injection attacks prey upon the fact that many modern dynamic web applications rely upon underlying databases to generate dynamic content. For example, a web application that relies upon a simple database driven authentication mechanism might store unencrypted user passwords in a database, and then, when a user attempts to log in, the application retrieves the correct password from the database and compares it to the user's input. If the passwords match, the user is successfully logged into the system. Now, this is not a good way to implement password authentication, but it's the reality of how many websites work. In this type of scenario, the web server requests the password from the database using a query written in the structured query language, or SQL. SQL is simply the language used by relational databases that allows users and applications to create, update, delete, and retrieve data. Now, you won't need to know how to write SQL queries on the exam, but it is helpful to look at some examples to help understand how SQL injection attacks work. When the web application that I mentioned earlier wants to retrieve a user's password from the database, it writes a query. The first part of the query, the select statement, tells the database that we're trying to retrieve information and the names of the specific fields that we'd like. Our application is asking for the username and password fields. The next part of the query, the from clause, gives the name of the database table containing the desired information. And then the final part of our query, the where clause, tells the database the specific records that we're interested in retrieving. In this case, the web application plugs in the username that the user entered. So, when I log into a web application using the username mchapel and the password apple, the web application sends a SQL query to the database that requests the correct password for the user named mchapel. If the password that I enter matches the password stored in the database, I'm good to go. Now, you can see here what the database query might look like in SQL. It's our template from before, but the information that I entered in the username field of the web application now appears in the where clause of the database query. Now, if I were a hacker, this might give me an idea. What if I tried to alter this query by entering some strange information in the username field? Suppose that instead of entering mchapel in that field, I enter some strange text. My username, followed by a single quote, a semicolon, a SQL command, and then a semicolon and 2 dashes. Here's what gets sent to the database in that case. Now, it's important to know that the semicolon separates commands in SQL, and 2 dashes designate comments, information that should be ignored. So let's take that input and rearrange it a little bit to make it more readable for you. What my handiwork here does is it actually sends 2 separate SQL commands and a comment to the database. The first command retrieves my password as desired, but the second one actually changes the password stored in the database for that account. It doesn't even matter if I enter the correct password the first time because I've just successfully changed the password to a value of my choice. I can now return to the login screen and use that new password to access the application. The trick to this attack is that I had to enter a single quote to break myself out of the quotation marks in the templated SQL statement. If I were trying to defend against this attack, I can try 2 techniques: input validation and parameterized queries. Input validation occurs when the web application inspects the input provided by a user to make sure that it's in an appropriate format. For example, the input should never contain a single quote. This check should always be performed by the web application on the server, where an attacker can't modify the test. If a developer tries to use a technique known as client-side validation, where the user's web browser validates input, an attacker can easily remove those checks and bypass input validation. The second SQL injection prevention technique is the use of parameterized SQL commands, such as stored procedures. In this type of SQL statements are stored on the server, sometimes in a precompiled format, where the input provided by applications is plugged in after the SQL is already processed. This type of query also prevents SQL injection attacks. Cross-site scripting attacks are quite dangerous because they can take place without the knowledge of the victim. These attacks, commonly abbreviated as XSS attacks, occur when an attacker embeds a malicious code in a third-party website that runs within the web browsers of other visitors to the site. Let's take a look at how they work. As you may know, web pages are made using HTML code. HTML is a markup language that allows web pages to have all sorts of advanced formatting other than just displaying plain text. HTML authors can add different fonts, include images, link to other sites, and even include small programs called scripts that run in the browsers of visitors to the site. HTML uses the concept of tags to perform all of these actions. For example, the B tag formats bold text, the I tag formats italicized text, and the A tag includes hyperlinks in text. When you're including a tag in a web page, you write the tag inside of brackets made using the greater than and less than signs. You first open the tag, then include your text, and then close the tag by including it again, but this time putting a forward slash in front of the tag. Here's an example of how you would bold some text, and it would appear like this. Here's how you would italicize some text, which would appear like this. And then here's how you would include a link to another site, which would then display with the familiar hyperlink formatting. Now, I mentioned earlier that you might want to also include some scripting in a web page that runs programs inside the user's browser. You do this using the script tag. For example, you might include this code in a web page that pops up a window in the reader's browser saying that the site is under construction. Scripting is a powerful tool, and it's perfectly legitimate when the scripts are written by the creator of a legitimate website. However, in a cross-site scripting attack, the attacker manages to trick a legitimate website into sending its users copies of a malicious script. This often happens when the site allows users to enter input that is displayed to other users. For example, an online auction site might accept postings from anyone in the world. Users posting to the site might want to dress up their auction listings with bold characters, images, and other enhancements, so the auction site owners allow them to write HTML code in their listings. Maybe someone selling a boat might want to make their boring listing a little more interesting by including HTML code in their input, making the listing appear more nicely in the browser, including a photo of the boat that's for sale. But what happens if the user includes unexpected HTML in their post, like a script that takes some malicious action on the viewer's computer? If the website simply takes this input and passes it along to other users, the users will see the same auction listing, but the malicious script will run in the background without the user's knowledge. Fortunately, it's easy to defend against cross-site scripting attacks. As with SQL injection attacks, the key is using input validation on any user input that includes HTML. Specifically, the input validation should watch for any attempts to use script tags in user-supplied input and remove any script code from the input. Another danger facing web applications is the threat of cross-site request forgery. These attacks are similar to cross-site scripting attacks, but they're even more dangerous. Now first, one quick note on terminology. Cross-site request forgery also goes by two different acronyms. Some people call it CSRF, while others use the XSRF acronym. Others even pronounce the acronym and call it CSRF. All of these terms refer to the same attack. As you may recall, cross-site scripting attacks occur when an attacker exploits a third-party website to include scripts written by the attacker in input shown to other users. The user's web browser then executes that code when it visits the site. Cross-site request forgery attacks go a step further and prey upon the fact that users often have multiple sites open at the same time, and they may be logged into many different sites in different browser tabs. As you may have noticed, authenticated sessions cross over between different browser tabs. Cross-site request forgery attacks leverage this by using one site to trick a user's browser into sending illegitimate requests to another site without the user's knowledge. Let's take a look at how this authentication works. As you can see here, I'm logged into LinkedIn, and I also have other tabs open for Wikipedia and Bank of America. If I go ahead and open a fourth tab and typed in the linkedin.com URL, I get to the site, and as you can see here, I'm already logged in. My browser has an authentication cookie from LinkedIn that works across all of these tabs. In fact, I can actually close this window completely, open a new window, and my authentication cookie will persist. This is a great convenience for users because it prevents them from having to log into sites multiple times. Cross-site request forgery attacks, however, prey upon these persistent authentication sessions in a manner similar to a cross-site scripting attack. Let's assume that we have an online payment service that accepts account transfers using web requests like the one you see here. The transfer funds page takes several arguments. These include the amount to transfer, the source account number, and the destination account number. Now, an attacker who knows this can try to exploit it using a cross-site request forgery attack by attempting to trick users into sending this command without their knowledge. One of the easiest ways to do this is to include a fake image tag in a web page that actually executes the desired command. Let's return to the example of an online auction site that we used in the video on cross-site scripting and try to use it for cross-site request forgery. We'll add another image tag down here at the bottom of the page. This image isn't an image at all, but rather a request to transfer funds from the user's checking account to the attacker's checking account. When the user loads the page, the boat sales listing looks completely normal, but the invisible image added to the page executes the unauthorized bank transfer. That's cross-site request forgery. Defending against cross-site request forgery is difficult, and it often requires re-architecting web applications to use cryptographically strong tokens in each exchange between authenticated users and a website. Other measures include preventing the use of HTTP GET requests to make cross-site request forgery attacks more difficult, advising users to log out when they're finished using a site, and, because they probably won't follow that advice, automatically logging users out after a short idle period. This is an inconvenience to end users, but it reduces the likelihood that a site will fall victim to a cross-site request forgery attack. Now, the attack we just discussed, cross-site request forgery, is a client-side attack. That is, it's an attack against a user. Server-side request forgery, or SSRF, is a variant on this attack that targets the server rather than a user. SSRF attacks tamper with the metadata used by server-side applications and seek to trick the server into retrieving malicious commands or destinations from what the server believes is a trusted source. When software engineers develop applications, they often set aside specific portions of memory to contain variable content. Users often provide answers to questions that are critical to the application's functioning and fill those memory buffers. If the developer fails to check that the input provided by the user is short enough to fit in the buffer, a buffer overflow occurs. The user content may overflow from the area reserved for input into an area used for other purposes, and unexpected results may take place. The easiest way to show this is with an example, so let's go back to WebGoat. You can see here that we have an application handling Wi-Fi charges for hotel rooms. I'm also going to start up the Zap proxy and then run through this page. I'm going to go ahead and enter my name and a hotel room number, and then press Submit. Here I am now in the Zap proxy, which has intercepted my request. I'm going to start walking through this step by step and just review the contents of each of the intermediate pages. Once I finish this, I return to the web browser and see that it's loaded a second page, step 2, where it's asking me to accept the price plan. I go ahead and do that, and here I am back in the Zap proxy. Once again, I step through this, and notice that the web application has placed my name and room number in hidden fields on this form, even though they didn't appear on the page that I just filled out. That's interesting. I'm going to go now and let this finish, and return to the web application. I'm going to restart it this time. Now I'm going to go ahead and type my name again. I'm going to attempt a buffer overflow attack this time. I'm going to assume that the web developers who created this application didn't put any limits on the room number that I can type in. I'm going to go ahead and type in a 4097-digit room number. I just happen to have one saved, already, which I'm going to copy and then paste into the room number field and press submit. I've now gotten to the page where it's asking me to select a pricing plan. I'm going to go back to Zap and tell it to intercept the next request. This time when I click accept terms, I go into Zap and I can see that it's about to submit the very, very long room number to the web application, and I go ahead and let that happen. This time when I scroll down, I see that it does have my name and my very long room number in the results. But if I keep scrolling down, I also notice that the web application has placed in here the names and room numbers of every other guest of the hotel. I've successfully conducted a buffer overflow attack against this web application. In this example, you saw how a buffer overflow can result in unexpected behavior. More specifically, I exploited a type of buffer overflow known as an integer overflow. I put in a 4,000 character room number when accessing a hotel Wi-Fi page and wound up viewing a list of all of the guests staying in the hotel. The simple use of input validation, limiting room numbers to 3 or 4 digits, would have prevented this problem. Code execution attacks are a special class of attack where the attacker exploits a vulnerability in a system that allows them to run commands on that system. There are many different ways that an attacker might gain this foothold on a system, but it's normally through some resource that the target system exposes to the world. For example, a public-facing web server must expose ports 80 and/or 443 to the world, and those ports provide access to the web server, such as Apache or Microsoft IIS. If an attacker learns of a code execution vulnerability in that web server software, the attacker may exploit that vulnerability on an unpatched server and use it to execute whatever commands they desire on the system. This condition, where an attacker runs commands of his or her choice, is known as arbitrary code execution. When it takes place from a remote system, it's also known as remote code execution. Attackers using code execution vulnerabilities may perform any action they desire on the targeted system. If the process they trick into executing their code is running with administrative privileges, they will gain full access to the system. Some of the actions an attacker might perform include installing malicious code, joining the system to a botnet, stealing sensitive information, or creating accounts to use for later access to the system. There are 2 simple steps that you can take to protect your systems against code execution attacks. First, when code execution attacks take place within an application running on a server, the code executes with the permissions of that application process. You should limit that access as much as possible, running application services with restricted accounts that follow the principle of least privilege. This will limit the damage caused by a successful code execution attack. Second, code execution attacks almost always exploit vulnerabilities in applications or operating systems. Many of these vulnerabilities are known and have existing patches. Keeping your operating systems and applications patched is an incredibly important and effective security control. For example, Microsoft released this security bulletin in March 2020. It describes a remote code execution vulnerability in Microsoft Windows, and specifically in the server message block or SMB protocol. An attacker can exploit this vulnerability against a server by sending it a specially crafted packet, or against a Windows client by using a malicious SMB server. There is a patch available to correct this vulnerability. By taking these 2 simple steps, limiting the use of administrative accounts and applying security updates, you can keep your systems protected against code execution vulnerabilities. Software developers must take care to write code that is not susceptible to privilege escalation attacks. These attacks seek to take normal user accounts and transform them into accounts with administrative rights. This can be especially dangerous on systems that have external exposures, allowing someone on the internet to take control of a server. These privilege escalation vulnerabilities often arise as a result of buffer overflow issues or other security issues in code that allow an end user to execute arbitrary code on the server. When the end user gets access to the underlying operating system, they can take advantage of privilege escalation vulnerabilities to leverage that access into gaining administrative privileges. There are some basic mitigation strategies that developers and operations teams can take to reduce the likelihood of successful privilege escalation attacks. First, developers should perform input validation on all input received from end users. This validation should perform strict checking to ensure that the input is in the expected format and of the correct length. Second, operations teams should ensure that the operating systems, platforms, and applications installed on servers are current supported versions and have all of the latest security patches. Third, developers and system engineers should work together to enforce the principle of least privilege. Any service accounts that support code execution should have the minimum set of privileges necessary to support the execution of that code. Granting these service accounts excess privileges can increase the access of an attacker who exploits the code. And finally, IT organizations should take advantage of controls designed specifically to prevent privilege escalation attacks. These include data execution prevention and address space layout randomization technologies. Following these simple safety measures can dramatically improve the security of code and prevent privilege escalation attacks. Web security vulnerabilities are among the trickiest problems tackled by cybersecurity professionals. The Open Worldwide Application Security Project, OWASP, maintains a list of the top 10 web security vulnerabilities that cybersecurity experts should understand and defend against to maintain secure web services. The current version of the OWASP Top 10 was developed in 2021. According to OWASP, the top 10 web security issues are broken access control, cryptographic failures, injection attacks, insecure design, security misconfigurations, vulnerable and outdated components, identification and authentication failures, software and data integrity failures, security logging and monitoring failures, and server-side request forgery. Broken access control occurs when developers fail to check on the back end whether a user is authorized to access a particular function of an application. Users with knowledge of the application may send requests directly to the server, bypassing the security controls built into the user interface. This category also includes insecure direct object references. These occur when a developer exposes some details of how an underlying application functions and then doesn't perform proper security checks to prevent unauthorized use of the application. For example, imagine a website URL like this one that has a user's account number embedded in the request. An attacker might try to simply change the account number to access a different account. If the web application doesn't check to make sure that the user is authorized to access that account, the attacker may gain unauthorized access. Cryptographic failures occur when an insecure web application accidentally exposes sensitive information to eavesdroppers. This may be as simple as accidentally placing an unencrypted customer file on a publicly accessible portion of a website, or it may occur when web server administrators fail to implement the HTTPS protocol to encrypt information sent over the internet. Injection flaws occur when an attacker is able to insert code into a request sent to a website, and then trick that website into passing the code along to a back-end server where it's executed. The most common example of this is the SQL injection attack against databases, which I'll cover in a future video. Insecure design traces security issues back to the initial creation of code. It includes issues that arise when an organization doesn't properly identify and satisfy security requirements, when it conducts insufficient threat modeling, and when it fails to follow security best practices. Organizations can combat this threat by using secure design patterns and following security reference architectures. Security misconfigurations occur because web applications depend upon a large number of complex systems, including web servers, application servers, database servers, firewalls, routers, and other components. Each of these has its own security settings, and an error anywhere in those settings could jeopardize the security of the entire system. Web developers must be very cautious about the components that they use to build their applications, as many of these components have known vulnerabilities. If a web application is built using a vulnerable component, attackers may exploit that component to attack the application itself. Administrators must be sure to monitor their environments regularly and apply security patches to components as soon as they're available. Identification and authentication failures occur when websites require that users authenticate, but then have flaws in the mechanisms that provide that authentication. I talk about how attackers might exploit this vulnerability using an attack called session hijacking in a video later in this course. Software and data integrity failures include issues that arise when an organization doesn't perform appropriate verification checks in their software pipeline. This can lead to corrupted or malicious updates to software and operating systems, insecure code injected into a development pipeline, and other critical failures. Security logging and monitoring failures occur when applications don't create detailed log records that contain information crucial to security investigations and troubleshooting efforts. Server-side request forgery, or SSRF attacks, occur when an attacker is able to trick a web server into retrieving a URL that has not been validated. I'll discuss this more in the request forgeries video later in this course. OWASP isn't the only organization that provides secure coding best practices. The SANS Institute provides a similar list of common programming errors that they call the top 25 most dangerous software errors. Another website that you may wish to visit is the Center for Internet Security. The center offers the cybersecurity community system design recommendations, as well as a comprehensive series of security benchmarks that describe the secure configuration of a wide variety of operating systems, applications, and programming environments. Directory traversal attacks are another common web application security flaw. These attacks allow the attacker to manipulate the file system structure on the web server. Let's first talk about two important characteristics of file systems. When using a Linux file system, a single period references the current directory, and using two periods references the directory one level up in the hierarchy. A directory traversal attack uses these navigation references to try to move up and down the directory structure, searching for unsecured files. These attacks work when an application allows a user to request files stored elsewhere on the file system. We're going to try one of these attacks using a tool called WebGoat. But first, here's a look at the file system that we'll be using in this exercise to help you understand what's happening in the demo. The thread safety problem.html file is the one that we're actually supposed to get with the web application. The Tomcat users.xml file is the one that we want to get our hands on. Now we're currently in the en directory, so we need to go up 4 levels to the .extract directory, and then from there go down into the conf directory and access the target file. Let's try a demo. We're going to use the WebGoat application again. This time, we also need to use another application called Zap. Zap is a web proxy that intercepts web requests and lets us modify them. We'll use it to modify a file request to include a directory traversal attack. Here in WebGoat, you can see we have some lesson plans that we can review. Normally, we just click on a file name, then click View File, scroll down, and see the contents of the file that the application intends to display. Now I'm going to try that again, but before I do, I'm going to go into Zap and tell it to intercept the request before it's sent to the web server. This time, when I click View File, WebGoat stops the request, and I can go in and edit the file name that's being requested before it's sent to the server. I'm going to change this to the path that we built together a moment ago. 4 sets of 2 periods, followed by the name of the conf directory and the Tomcat users.xml file. Then I'm going to go ahead and let the request go. If I now return to the web browser and scroll down, you'll see that instead of the thread safety problem lesson plan, I now have the contents of the Tomcat users file from elsewhere on the web server. Directory traversal attacks are dangerous because they allow attackers to bypass normal access controls and view sensitive files stored on a web server. There are 2 ways you can defend your applications against directory traversal attacks. First, you can use input validation to prevent the inclusion of periods in user requests. Second, you can set strict file system access controls to limit the web server user's ability to read sensitive files. Race conditions are a particularly dangerous security flaw that require careful attention from software developers. A race condition occurs when the proper functioning of a security control depends upon the timing of activities performed by the computer or the user. If the timing doesn't occur as expected, the software may behave in an unexpected manner, causing a significant security vulnerability. A common example of a race condition is the time of check to time of use, or TOC2 vulnerability. In a TOC2 vulnerability, software checks to see whether an activity is authorized, and then some time elapses before it performs the action that it checked. Let's take a look at an example of a bank account. Imagine an ATM machine that dispenses cash. The algorithm for this machine might work like this. The user inserts an ATM card, enters a PIN, The machine verifies the PIN and checks the available account balance. The user requests an amount of money, and then the machine dispenses the money if it's less than the available balance that it previously checked. Now that sounds good, right? Well, if there were only one ATM machine in the world, this might work fine. But what if two users are standing next to each other and they both go through this process at the same time, accessing the same account? User 1 and User 2 both get to step 3 at the same time, and both ATM machines learn that there is $1,000 available in the account. Both users then request to withdraw $750 from the account. The machines know that the account has $1,000, so they each give their user the requested $750. The account is now overdrawn by $500. We could easily modify this algorithm to prevent the talk-to race condition. We do this by adding a lock that prevents two users from accessing the same account at the same time. When the first user accessed the account at the first ATM, it will put a lock on the account, preventing the second user from starting a transaction until the first transaction completes. Race conditions can have a significant impact on application security. Developers must understand the security risks and plan their code to avoid these issues. I hope that you've enjoyed this course. It's been my pleasure to guide you through the world of vulnerability scanning with Nessus. If you haven't already done so, now would be a great opportunity to get some hands-on experience. If you have permission, try running some scans in your own environment. If you try this on your home network, you might be surprised at what you discover. Your thermostat, home theater system, or baby monitor might have a critical vulnerability.